There's a vicious cycle for workers being in low-paying jobs where they oftentimes have multiple jobs to make ends meet. They have all sorts of health problems. They have lower cognitive ability, and then they have attendance problems.
Yeah.
They can't focus on the job. There's a lot of research that shows that low pay is associated with more mistakes, lower productivity.
Yeah.
And then they get stuck in a vicious cycle of their own because they can't get promoted because their performance is low. Of course, their performance suffers, their well-being suffers, but so does turnover in organizations.
Meet over half of the working world. They are the machine that powers our society, from making your coffee and emptying your garbage to caring for your relatives and delivering your parcels. You might see them as frontline or essential workers, or you might not see them at all. The Invisible Worker podcast explores the financial landscape of our most diligent workforce. We speak to experts in mobility, inclusion, policy, research, and more to find out where the problems are and how we can start to fix them. My name is Emily and I host the Invisible Worker podcast, brought to you by Stream, the world's leading financial wellbeing provider. On today's episode, we're talking about jobs, because work and getting paid for that work is the most important factor that influences the financial lives of the working majority. I'm joined today by Zeynep Ton, Professor in Practice at MIT Sloan School of Business and founder of the Good Jobs Institute. Zeynep, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. And I loved how you started the podcast.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, it's all about understanding those essential workers and seeing their lived realities.
Absolutely.
And your book, The Case for Good Jobs, really spoke to me. And I have to confess, it is the first time I have ever cried reading a business book.
Oh, thank you so much.
I found it so incredibly moving, and the stories and the potential and the hope that was in that book. And I really want to unpack that with you today. It was a rallying cry for change. And I want to understand how you got there. And as I understand it, it all started with volleyball.
Oh, you go way back.
I go way back, yeah.
It started with volleyball. That's how I got to come to the United States.
Okay.
Coach Ross Rose from Penn State took a leap of faith and gave me a volleyball scholarship. And I went to Penn State, studied industrial engineering, and then from there on went to Harvard Business School to do my doctorate. And that's where I started doing my research in operations first and then moved slowly to the work side.
You've written about good jobs. You've created a nonprofit to help companies create good jobs. But I want to start with bad jobs, because there's a lot of bad jobs out there. And I was trying to quantify how many bad jobs they are. And there's lots of different ways you could define a bad job. One of the ways you define it, though, is insufficient pay.
Yeah. I think at a fundamental level, a bad job is one where basic dignity is missing.
Yeah.
And that basic dignity comes from a couple sources. One of them is pay, but there are two other sources that are important. One of them is safety, of course. No one wants to go to work and get hurt.
Yeah.
The other is respect. And respect is being treated like a human being versus a pair of hands, versus being treated like a human robot. And the third piece is pay, but more broadly, economic security.
Yeah.
There are different components to pay. One of them is, of course, the pay and benefits, but in the sectors that you described when you started the podcast, retail, restaurants, hospitality, these workers oftentimes work in industries where schedules are unpredictable, and so their pay is unpredictable. So that economic security comes from pay, schedules, and also career paths to be able to move up to higher paid jobs. And what I found in my research is when people don't earn enough to take care of their families, and again, pay comes from multiple components, when they don't earn enough to take care of their families, of course, their performance suffers, their well-being suffers, but so does performance of themselves at work, and so does turnover in organizations. And when companies operate with high employee turnover, then they end up designing the job in a way that almost guarantees that basic respect will be lacking. Because they see people coming and going, and they take all the decision rights away from workers. And so low pay goes hand in hand with lack of respect because people are being treated like robots at the end.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle. and it's prolific. It's prevalent in America and it's prevalent globally. And again, trying to quantify this, I know you've spent some work trying to quantify the cost of it. I've thought about, and I've used your book as a guide to try and understand how many Americans are in bad jobs. And so in a labor market where there's 164 million Americans in work, the Economic Policy Institute estimates that 26 million workers are paid less than $17 per hour. And there is not a single state where $17 per hour is adequate, according to the MIT living wage calculator. That's one estimate, 26 million. The Bureau of Labor Statistics finds that the median hourly wage for hourly paid workers is $23.73. Again, nowhere near. So you could say hourly paid workers definitionally sit in that bucket. The Financial Health Network estimates that 15% of people in work are financially vulnerable. So that's nearly 25 million people. The government spent $64 billion on earned income tax credit last year. So that's families in work, and that benefited 23 million people, but they think 1 in 5 fail to claim. So that goes up to 29 million people. Or you can just say about 60% of jobs in America are frontline jobs. And so that's 98 million people potentially in bad jobs. So I've got estimates from 25 up to close to 100 million people out of a workforce of 164 million. It's a big problem.
Yeah, even if you look at the lower end, it's a big problem.
It's a big problem. And the Good Jobs Institute, the charity that you founded, has an ambition to create 10 million good jobs by 2027. That's punchy.
Yes, we work with companies and we help them redesign their operations in a way that creates high productivity so that companies can pay their workers more and offer them much better jobs. And our hope is that by 2027, we will have made a difference both directly through working with companies and indirectly through the companies that we work with and them encouraging others to change to get to 10 million. I'm not sure if we're going to get to 10 million by 2027, but we will get there.
But you need a big goal, right?
Yes.
Start big, aim high.
Exactly.
Settle for 8 million, right?
I'm going to go for 10
You're going to go for 10. You're going to go for 10.
I'm going to go for 10 million.
And look, you know, bad jobs are not just bad for people and bad for employers. They are a public health crisis. The research that you presented, the effects of even a very small pay increase decreases unmet medical needs. It increases nutrition. It decreases smoking, child neglect, low birth weight babies, teen pregnancies. Think of the social cost of low pay. It's huge.
Yeah, and in my MBA classroom, every year I use one case to talk about low wages and the effect of low wages, mostly on the companies, but we spend about 20 minutes talking about the effect of low wages on workers as well. And in preparation for the class, my students read about the effects that you mentioned and cognitive ability, the bandwidth tax, which is associated with a 13 drop in IQ. And there's oftentimes silence in the classroom, and my students are shocked to hear how much $1 or $2 an hour can make a difference in the lives of workers. I wish more MBA students were exposed to that research.
It is shocking. And I know the research you're speaking of, that 13 IQ point drop in available IQ, which is more damaging than losing a full night's sleep or the effects of long-term alcoholism. And again, if you think about not just the worker, but the employer, imagine if you could lift the IQ of your workforce by 13 points. Wouldn't you do it?
Yeah. And Emily, you mentioned the vicious cycle for workers. Yeah. There's also a vicious cycle for workers being in low-paying jobs where they oftentimes have multiple jobs to make ends meet. They have all sorts of health problems. They have lower cognitive ability, and then they have attendance problems. Yeah. They can't focus on the job. There's a lot of research that shows that low pay is associated with more mistakes, lower productivity. Yeah. And then they get stuck in a vicious cycle of their own because they can't get promoted because their performance is low. And what is worse is managers look at the workers in that system, then they assume that, look, we're asking them to do a very simple job and they can't do it. They're coming late all the time. So when workers work in that system, it changes leaders' assumptions about those workers, and they start labeling those workers as lazy or not wanting to take responsibility or not wanting to work hard. And that's a huge problem.
It is a huge problem, and it's a systems problem, right?
Absolutely.
Not a people problem. And I know that you are quite passionate about taking service jobs and taking frontline work and elevating it. And in fact, you recently wrote about how service jobs will be the next middle-class jobs. And especially with the advent of AI, when you look at which jobs are going to be chipped away at by technology, what's left other than service jobs and frontline work? I'd love for you to dig into that a bit more.
Yeah, I would love for us to pay a lot more attention to essential workers and essential work and take the service work seriously.
Yeah.
Because in many parts of the world, service workers are still treated as unskilled workers, or the work is treated as unskilled work. And I would love for us to retire that language and see that this is essential work, it's important work, it's the work that will stay with us for a long time. And that's where the job growth is coming from. And that's where so many jobs are. One of my favorite statistics now is that more Americans work at Walmart stores than in US car factories. Yeah. And this includes final assembly and parts as well. So that just shows it last year in May 2023. Why don't we take this work seriously? Why don't we see this as the one that will create that strong middle class? And how can we create a strong middle class if we don't figure out a way to make these jobs good jobs? I just don't see how the numbers would work. Maybe there are some others out there who can, but unless we take these jobs more seriously, I can't see how we can get to a strong middle class in the United States.
You've made a pitch for investing in service jobs and building a strong middle class. You've come up with the good jobs system. I know you initially called it the good jobs strategy, but it is all about a systems change. Walk me through that.
Yeah, and maybe I can start with how I got there.
Yes.
Because I'm not your typical person to talk about good jobs because of what my field is. I'm an operations management professor. My field is about designing systems that continuously improve value for the customer. So I grew up studying quality movement, Toyota production system, and early on in my work, I was looking at inventory problems inside retail stores. Yeah. And what I found was that there were so many problems inside the retail stores that were big and expensive. For example, old milk was still on the shelves, taking up shelf space.
That's the milk my husband buys.
Yes, exactly. Or the inventory data were inaccurate. These problems were so expensive and costing companies tens of millions of dollars. And when I looked into why these problems happen all the time, one of the big causes had to do with labor practices. Okay. Stores that had more employee turnover had more problems. Stores that were understaffed had more problems. And then I saw that there were two ways to maximize profits in the retail landscape. So one way was to see people as a cost and minimize that cost, low investment in people, and operate with high employee turnover and low productivity. That was one way, and that was a dominant approach.
It doesn't sound like a good way.
But you can make profits, because you don't pay for workers so much. Yes, there are mistakes, but those are just way of life. But then there was another approach which was not as dominant. It was less practiced by companies like Costco, Quick Trip, which is a convenience store chain with gas stations, Mercadona, Spain's largest supermarket chain. Yeah. And that was seeing employees as drivers of value, drivers of growth, drivers of profitability, investing in them, operating with low employee turnover, and creating high productivity. Now, both of these approaches is profitable. The former approach leaves employees and oftentimes customers behind. Your husband will come home with the spoiled milk. Yeah. The latter approach is maximizing profits while being loved by your customers and employees. The second approach doesn't work just by investing in people. There's the investment in people part, but then there are operational choices, which is the system part that create highly productive and motivating work, which is the secret sauce of the good job strategy.
I've read your operational choices, and so they were focus and simplify, standardize and empower, cross-train, and operate with Slack.
Yes.
They sound really obvious. Why isn't everybody doing this?
They sound really obvious, and in fact, when my first book came out, that was one of the most common reactions.
Yeah, and that was 2014, your first book.
This was 2014, and the book was called Good Job Strategy. But obvious doesn't mean that it's going to be practiced. There are all sorts of forces against it. Organizations work in silos. Each silo try to optimize, and they end up making choices that don't work as well as a system, and simple things don't get practiced.
Yeah, well, I see that a lot in my day job when I think about the financial lives of the working majority, and the people who make decisions do not have the lived experience of the people the decisions are impacting. Yeah. And that plays out in so many ways. But in the system of financial services, it means that products aren't designed to meet the circumstances and needs of the working majority. And it sounds like from what you've seen, work isn't designed to meet the working majority.
That's exactly right. For example, if you go to a fashion retailer, somebody who works in merchandising, they might decide that they're going to run a promotion. They're going to change the location of certain items and they're going to change the prices of certain items.
Yeah.
And in the last minute, they said, I'm not going to make the promotion next week. I'm going to change it to the week after. For them, it's a very small decision.
Yeah.
And it's a decision that will improve their sales. But that decision, when you put it, the effect of that decision on the whole system, now that choice ends up affecting the work schedules of the workers on the floor.
Yeah.
But the person on merchandising, when they're making the decision about when to run a promotion,
but they're not running the schedule.
Not thinking about, they're not running the schedules. That's not part of, and they're not at the stores all the time. So, and us humans, we're limited, right? We can't think of everything.
Yeah. So you have to actually create a whole system change in order to improve the jobs of everybody and to improve productivity. So can you take a little bit of time and walk me through those 4 operational choices and how those play out?
Yes. And maybe I can give you a contrast between, like I can describe a grocery store that has those choices and a grocery store that doesn't have choices, right? Yeah. So if you go to a typical grocery store and you'll see people at the checkout bagging and checking customers out, oftentimes that's the only job they have. They're working at the checkout.
Yeah.
And when there are customers, they are busy. When there aren't customers, they're waiting for customers to come. They're chatting with their friends, etc. At a good job system, at a Trader Joe's store, the person who's doing the checkout, when there are customers, they check out customers. When there aren't customers, they're shelving merchandise. They're cleaning the stores because they're cross-trained.
Right.
So that's the cross-training part. In our typical supermarket, the job itself takes a long time because the supermarkets might run so many promotions. They might have coupons. They might have price changes. Old milk might be on the checkout, and now we have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Whereas at a good job system, everything is simplified. Their leaders are constantly thinking about how do I simplify things. So workers by design work so much faster. In the typical one, if there are problems, let's say some of the eggs were cracked.
Yeah.
The checkout clerk would have to ask their supervisor for help because they're not empowered to make decisions.
I've had that, and you're
I
waiting
mean, all
for
of
the
us have
manager.
had that, right? All of us have had that. You ask your supervisor for help, even for simple things that you know you can solve, because the company doesn't trust you. The company doesn't trust you because turnover is high. People come and go, and they can't create that type of trust. In the good jobs grocery store, empowered employees will solve those problems. And so you can see how the one is highly productive, and they can serve the customer so much faster and better. The other one is less productive, and customers are waiting, employees are wasting their time. Now, operate with Slack is something that I didn't describe in this. I mentioned the simplification, empowerment, and cross-training. In a typical supermarket, you might see a long line and you might see only 3 of the 4 checkouts full of people. The others might be empty, which drives customers crazy. Like, why are we waiting for a long time?
Yeah, or you're on the self-service and there's nobody there to help you when your item gets stuck.
What companies soon discover is self-service is not automation. It's outsourcing the work to the customer. Customers are slower, they make more mistakes, and there are all sorts of issues with that. But in a good job system, these companies operate with Slack. They always try to have more people than the expected workload, which means that people can go through the checkout as quickly as possible. Things are accurate, and this operating with Slack ensures higher sales and fewer mistakes. Now, you can't operate with Slack if you have slackers, right? So the good job system, again, high expectations, high performance, high trust. You need people to come and work hard every single day. So it's a system that drives high productivity. It's a system that drives dignity. People love high expectations, and people love to work with others who are working hard. Nobody likes to work with somebody who will pull the whole team down.
No, it's maddening.
And it's a high trust system, and it's a system that makes people feel valued, and they create a lot of value.
It feels hard to make that leap. So most of what you've described is obvious, but getting to that point where you can operate with Slack and have that high productivity and high expectations feels very far away from where a lot of workplaces are today. How do you get there? How do you take employers on that journey?
Emily, that's exactly what I heard from so many CEOs after my first book came out. They said, we are stuck in that vicious cycle you're describing.
Yeah.
We don't want to operate in that cycle, but we can't see how we get out. It's not as simple as just pay your workers more.
And it feels expensive.
It feels
too.
daunting.
Yeah.
And it's expensive and it's daunting. So many different functions need to be involved. So how do you start something like that?
And these are low margin businesses, so there's not a lot of extra money to go and make these investments.
Exactly. These are oftentimes single-digit margin businesses, and labor costs represent a huge chunk of operating expenses. So these leaders are evil people who want to screw workers. They would rather do the right thing, but it seems so hard for them to do.
Yeah.
So to be able to help these leaders, I co-founded the nonprofit Good Jobs Institute, and now we work with over 30 companies.
Okay.
And we've had successes, we've had failures. Some companies changed, some companies didn't change. And what we've learned from all these was it is really important to create competitive urgency around solving this problem.
Okay.
So the companies that were able to change, their leaders were convinced that if they don't change, they're going to fall behind competitively. They're not going to be able to survive and grow because they couldn't create great value for their customers. And they were also convinced that they can't create great value for their customers if they don't have a high-performing frontline team. So once that logic clicked, we can't survive and grow unless we change. Then they brought a bunch of people together and started on the change journey. But I think the most important part was creating that competitive urgency and finding a real problem to solve for the organization.
So it has to feel existential.
Yes. Just initially, our initial approach was let us identify the cost of the bad job system. And maybe if we identify the financial costs, companies will change. But guess what? Even with those costs, they can survive. They can make money. Mediocrity is profitable. So that wasn't enough for us to be able to change the companies. The competitive urgency drove them to change.
I was thinking about this as I was reading your book, and I knew we were having this conversation, and I was thinking about the question of who bears the cost of bad jobs, right? And how do you create urgency that goes beyond employers? And so, yes, companies bear some of the cost. Mm-hmm. Absenteeism, presenteeism, distraction at work, those add up into the trillions when you're quantifying that for the US alone. But taxpayers bear a lot of the costs too. And I looked at all the different programs that support people in work who are on an inadequate income, so because they're a bad job, and Medicaid or earned income tax credit or SNAP food programs or housing support or childcare support. And using some back of the envelope math, I got to a number of more than $724 billion out of the government's $2 trillion annual spend on these sort of social security and social welfare programs. So it's a huge taxpayer cost as well. We're picking up the price tag of companies operating in bad jobs, but also from an individual level, you got to look at who is in these jobs, and it's women, it's individuals who are Black or Hispanic or Latin backgrounds. It's often single parents, and it's children. There's all these costs that flow through. But it felt to me like there's almost an urgent government need to intervene here, because that's over a third of that $2 trillion budget is paying the cost of companies having bad jobs.
I think one way to do that would be to quantify these costs and see if that's motivation enough for change. But another could be at the government level to create an urgency around this problem. And that competitive urgency might come from another source. I'm not a public policy expert, so excuse me if I'm totally wrong here, but I guess if I were given the job, I would try to find an existential threat. Similar to what we have seen in companies. And if you look at the United States, I guess my existential threat would be we don't have a strong middle class. And democracies don't survive and they can't flourish without a strong middle class. The only way to get to a strong middle class is to make frontline service jobs good jobs. The only way to do that is by creating high productivity and high dignity jobs. Now, what do we need to do to be able to do that? What changes can we make to get to that high productivity, high dignity service job? So I guess I would start with existential, something like a competitive threat that might motivate people to pay attention to this.
Yeah, maybe we're at that moment. So there's both your comment on democracy, but also there's the potential that AI will diminish current middle class jobs. And so you create a bigger pool of people. There's a necessity to turn service jobs into good jobs.
Exactly. If you look at the top 5 occupations with the most number of job growth, they are care workers, cooks, fast food workers, because these are the jobs that are less likely to be taken over by AI. Of course, automation is real, technology is there, many of the tasks can be automated.
Yeah.
But just because a task can be automated doesn't mean that a job will be. And these service jobs are least likely to be fully automated by AI and robots. So it brings even more urgency for the future, because if this is where the job growth is coming from, and if we don't make them good jobs, where will people go? Where will the 40 million people go?
Gosh, it really does feel urgent.
I believe in the power of clever, intelligent people who care about their company to get together to solve a problem if they agree on the problem.
Yeah. And here's one thing I found super insightful from your book, which is the correlation between businesses hiring MBA grads and a dampening of wages. And so you wrote about when a CEO with a business degree takes over from a non-MBA CEO, average wages decline by 6% in the next 5 years. And there's no increase in productivity. So wages are going down, but productivity stays flat. And in fact, the increase in people employed by MBA leaders is responsible for 15% of the wage slowdown since 1980.
Yes.
So do we need to go back to source and change how MBA programs are run? I mean, you're doing your bit, right?
Yeah. First, that's the research of Daron Acemoglu and his colleagues. So it's not my work, but that is exactly what they found. And I think we can do a much better job in the MBA education to educate the next generation of leaders. At a minimum, we can help them see that people are not a cost to be minimized.
Yeah.
Market pay is not the right pay if it's not a living wage. There are all sorts of consequences for workers and for companies. Lean and mean isn't efficient. So one of the things that we need to do is to help our students see that people are not a cost. It's not soybeans we're dealing with. We're dealing with humans, and instead see them as drivers of revenue, growth, and differentiation. And we also need to teach our students how to design these human-centered systems. And one thing I wish all MBA schools did was to work harder to create more empathy among our students for frontline workers. We have all sorts of programs for our students to learn more about innovation, technology, interact with business leaders. Why don't we create programs for them to interact with frontline workers to create empathy? I think there's a lot that we can do on that dimension as well.
Yeah, or go do those jobs.
On the first day of class, I tell all my students, I strongly recommend that while you are on your second year at MIT Sloan, take a frontline job. It could be 10 hours a week. Take a frontline job. You're going to see first, you're going to change your assumptions about humans. You're going to see how hardworking people are and how the system itself fails them. And second, you're going to see how the decisions that you're going to make in the organizations prevent them from creating value.
Yeah.
So some of my students take that advice and they tell me it makes a big difference for them.
I have a really strong memory of a frontline job when I first moved to London. And I worked for a couple of months at a health club as a receptionist on the front desk. And there were a couple of things that made it a bad job. So I could answer the phone, but I couldn't make an outbound phone call. The phones were set so that the reception team couldn't dial out. I think they assumed people would just be on the phone, blocking the lines, making personal calls. So if someone phoned and had a question that I couldn't answer in the moment, I couldn't then phone them back. I had to go get a manager to phone them back from the back office. And then I couldn't leave the desk to do anything. And I used to spend my days refolding towels. They'd make fun of me. I just wanted something to do. So I'd refold the already folded towels to hand them back out because there was nothing to do. If people weren't turning up, I just stood there. And I'm sure I could have been phoning customers back or giving somebody a tour or solving something, but I was stuck.
Yeah. What I think a huge learning point is similar to what your experience is. Highly motivated, highly capable people when they're in a system that prevents them from doing a good job, won't be able to do a good job.
Yeah, you couldn't.
And every year I have the founder of Costco who comes to class, and there's the meat manager from Costco who comes to class, and he talks about his job, and everybody is inspired by him. But then the next day we talk about how if you put that manager in a different work environment, he won't be able to produce as much. And similarly, if you take a worker from another company that doesn't do the good job strategy, put them into Costco, by design, they're going to do a much better job. It comes back to the inherent capabilities of people versus the system that they operate in. I'm not saying every single human is capable of operating in every single environment. That's why we have hiring practices, right? But there are so many people who can shine in these systems if they were allowed to.
Yeah, and when you design the system for outliers, you get the outlier behavior.
Exactly. You get all your workforce behaving that way.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about Theory X and Theory Y managers, because these are kind of the two schools of thought around how people behave.
Yeah, and I love this theory. It's by Douglas McGregor, who was an MIT Sloan professor. And he, in his theory, so Theory X managers, they assume that people are inherently lazy. They don't want to work. They don't want to take on responsibility. And the only reason they go to work is that they make money and they feed their family. Theory Y managers have a different assumption about humans. They think that most people want to go to work to do a good job. They want to be empowered. They want to take on responsibility. They want to work hard. They want to create value for the customer. The brilliant thing about McGregor's theory is that whatever assumption you have about workers, you are going to be proven right.
Okay.
Because if you think that people don't want to work hard, if you think they're lazy, if you think they're going to cheat, they're going to steal, they're going to do, then you're going to end up designing a system that proves that they behave that way. If you think that people are inherently motivated to do a good job, then you're going to design a system that proves that. And one of my favorite examples of this, how the same human can behave very differently depending on what the manager's assumptions about people are, is one of the factories, and I described this in the book, a GM plant in Fremont, California, that closed in 1982. It was a unionized plant. They had strikes. There was sex, alcohol, drugs, gambling, whatever was illegal was happening. It was a wild workplace, and GM closed that plant.
Okay.
2 years later, Toyota came to the United States to the joint venture with GM. They reopened that plant. They hired most of the same people.
Interesting.
They kept the same union. They had the same technology. That plant became the most productive auto plant in the United States. Wow. So same people, same technology, same union, very different performance. Why? Because Toyota managers think that people want to do a good job.
Yeah.
In the old system, that there are beautiful quotes by different workers. They will say it was mind-numbing work, 8 hours a day. It was degrading. And then they talk about the Toyota system. They say, yeah, the work itself is physical. It's not glamorous work, but I get to learn. I get to improve every single day. And that's so motivating.
And that's so much of the value exchange of work. Like, yes, there are dollars or euros or pounds at the end of the day, but a lot of it is about your sense of worth and your sense of fulfillment and growth and learning. And again, there's data that shows people would be willing to forego a pay rise for more dignity at work, for better working conditions, for more progression opportunities. That there's actually a lot of things people value more highly than pay, with the caveat that pay needs to be at an appropriate level to survive.
Yes, as long as pay is enough to be able to put food on the table and take care of your family, absolutely. I tell my students a quote from the late Clay Christensen, that management is among the most noble professions if it's done right.
Zeynep, I want you to take me through a few case studies of companies you've worked with who have implemented the good job system. And one thing we haven't spoken a lot about is pay, and actually some quite dramatic pay rises that come with this.
Yeah, maybe I'll take you through an example of Sam's Club, which is Costco's largest competitor, and it's owned by Walmart.
Yeah. And Costco is well known for being an excellent employer. They're nailing it. Yeah.
They are the epitome of a good jobs company.
Yeah.
But I can walk you through the Sam's Club case. In 2017, John Furner becomes the CEO of Sam's Club. And at that time, Sam's Club is really struggling. They have low labor productivity, low sales per square foot. Their employees are not happy. Turnover is 60%, costing them a lot of money. Their customers are not happy. The prices are too high. And John is Sam's Club's 14th CEO in 34 years. So that's an important fact because it's a lot of CEOs. It means that he doesn't have that much time, right? So he needs to turn this company around quickly because in 2 or 3 years, he will likely either be promoted or go someplace else.
Yeah, politely asked to leave. Yeah.
So he comes to the conclusion that for us to grow and succeed, we have to be loved by our members, which is their customers.
Yeah.
And to be loved by our members, we have to set our teams up for success and invest in them. They found that so many of their customer-related problems happened because they had high employee turnover.
Okay.
They did a ton of simplification. They did brilliant use of technology to simplify. They standardized. They cross-trained. Like the 4 choices, they did a lot.
Yeah.
And those choices enabled them to be able to invest in their workers. And the 2 big investments was one, pay.
Yeah.
And for tens of thousands of people, these were meat cutters, bakery specialists, team leads. They raised pay from around $15 an hour to $20 to $22 an hour. So $5 to $7 pay increase for these workers.
That's huge.
Along with the pay increases, they created stable, consistent schedules for their full-time workers.
Okay.
And during this process, they also increased the percentage of their full-time employees. So huge changes on the employee side. When they announced the pay raises and the schedule changes, some of their employees cried.
Yeah,
because
I would.
For them, it was the difference between working 1 or 2 jobs. The schedule changes, it was a difference between spending time with their families or not. So employee turnover, of course, went down. And for Sam's Club, within 2 years, they raised their sales 25% without opening a single store, which is a huge deal.
That's amazing.
They improved their labor productivity by 16%. It now is a growth engine.
You wrote about institutional isomorphism. I like that term. So, the process, it's really social referencing. Organizations tend to become more similar over time because they see the social proof of everybody else doing what they're doing. And this goes against the grain because everybody is operating in the way you described earlier, which is seeing people as a cost, trying to minimize that cost, accepting high turnover, accepting low productivity, and being successful for now in that way. So how do we cross the chasm? So how do we get more company? How do we blast through your goal of 10 million new good jobs by creating more social proof? Because you've got a big company like Sam's Club and now looking at Walmart, we've got Costco doing it. If they're doing it, why isn't everybody else looking at them and saying, well, obviously that's the path?
Yeah, that's my hope, Emily. And it's not just Sam's Club, right? Because if it was just Sam's Club, people might say, well, this is a membership-based model. It works there. It might not work in other places. We work with a small restaurant that did this. A call center did it. A pest control business has done it. So we need to create enough case examples and be able to talk about them publicly that encourage more people to change. And I think the other thing that we're working on at Good Jobs Institute is we need to create a playbook or a product for how to make the change a little bit more palatable for companies. It's not an easy change. Organizations are run by imperfect humans. So how do we create a process that companies can follow, and how can we make it easier for them to make the system change? Because system change is not easy.
There's also a human behavior point, I think, which is intuitively we feel like we should be able to solve this in a different way. So I draw parallels from the financial services system as well. We feel like we should be able to just train people better or educate them better. And I come across this all the time in the world of financial products, which is, why don't we just teach people to budget when that's not the problem? The problem is they don't know how much they're going to get paid, so they can't budget. Or why don't we just invest in training so that they can do a better job? But that's not the problem, as you've articulated. The problem is they're understaffed and they can't do a better job. But we want to lean into these easy solutions because then it feels like it's not our fault. Like we're not creating a system that's helping people fail. The problem is them. And so I come back to maybe that theory X, theory Y point.
Yeah, I think the first easy solution, so we can sleep at night. We feel like we're doing something.
Yeah. Pat on the back, job done.
And these solutions don't require system change. Who can argue against training? Who can argue against education? I mean, I
do.
Right? Wouldn't you want people to have more education, to have more? Yes, of course. But that's not going to solve the problems. The problem isn't that people are not capable of doing a good job. The problem is that we're not creating work that requires expertise right now. We're not creating work that creates a lot of value with empowerment, cross-training, operating with Slack, simplifications, etc. We need to create that work and invest in people.
Yeah.
The first thing is, let's make sure we meet the basic needs of humans so they can live, and then we can get to other things.
Okay, I have some tricky questions for you.
Okay.
Are you ready for them?
I'm ready. Also, with half of my brain working, we'll see.
I've been mulling over this. A big part of the good job strategy is the idea that you get a competitive advantage, right? You lower your turnover, you have a stable workforce, you delight your customers, you can be more competitive. Is that true at scale, or is it true because it's rare?
Oh, it is true at scale.
It's true at scale.
We don't see it at scale right now because there are so few companies do it. I think Sam's Club and Costco offer a great example of how it can be true at scale. Because competitive advantage doesn't come from necessarily the good job strategy. Competitive advantage comes from always improving the value for the customers.
Okay, I love that. I was thinking about that. My next tricky question for you.
Okay.
I'm sure you've had these all before.
I don't know.
Seasonal businesses. So I'm thinking like hospitality, where in the summer you might get a big peak and you'll get a big peak around Christmas time. One of the parts of the good job strategy is stable schedules and sufficient pay. How do you make that work in a seasonal business?
Yeah, and much of service industries are seasonal businesses.
Yeah.
Right? Customer demand fluctuates over time.
Yes.
One of the 4 choices of the good job strategy is focus and simplify, and that simplification has workload smoothing as part of it. How much can you smooth the workload? So there's some traffic that comes from customers, that's seasonal, but how can you schedule other tasks to make that workload as smooth as possible? And it might be that certain businesses might rely on more part-timers than others. So seasonality is oftentimes dealt with using a percentage of workers who are part-timers. And what's nice about that is that it could be high school students, it could be college students, and those part-timers, if they choose to have a career, the good ones could move up and become full-timers and have a career in the organization. But looking for ways to smooth the workload, looking for ways to cross-train employees so that they can do a bunch of different ways, flexibility on the work side, and using some seasonal part-time labor is the way that companies handle seasonality.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was trying to wrap my head around how you would do this with a stable workforce and seasonal businesses. Yeah. Another thing I was thinking about is around when you are trying to create more full-time jobs, does that mean a decrease in the number of workers? So does the increase in full-time jobs, because a big part of the good job strategy is a sufficient rate of pay combined with sufficient hours for that stable income. So does that necessitate a reduction in headcount, or is that an outcome?
Yeah, it can. And oftentimes what ends up happening is fewer, more invested people who are able to meet the same customer demand and delight the customer. They are more equipped, they're more empowered to do a good job. We are not maximizing for the number of jobs. Like our problem going forward, especially in countries like the United States with aging population, is not necessarily to maximize the number of jobs, but to maximize the quality of jobs.
And the productivity so that you can support that aging population.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Got it. Okay. Unions and cross-training. This is maybe less of an issue in America. It's more of an issue in my home market in the United Kingdom, where I've spoken to some companies, some large grocers, in fact, saying I was going to come to meet you and did they have any questions? And unions came up. They were expressing how difficult it would be to cross-train because certain functions or skills are quite protected by unions. What's your experience working with unions?
I don't have experience working with unions because the service sector, the frontline service sector, their share of unionization is so low. So we haven't come across with organizations that do unions.
That are heavily unionized.
What I can say is that there are examples of companies that have been able to work with unions and that have been able to cross-train their workers. One of the cases I teach, of course, now they're another great case study, is Southwest Airlines, which is one of the most unionized airlines, and even their pilots would help with luggages and all sorts of things to turn that plane around as quickly as possible. But that was because Southwest had a policy of no layoffs, which provided a very strong relationship with the union and the management. The union knew that Southwest loved the workers and wanted to create good jobs for workers. I assume management also had good relationships with the unions, and they ended up supporting that type of cross-training because they had more trust in their relationship. I think less than 5% of retail and less than 3% of restaurants are unionized.
You've got answers to all my questions. My last question comes back to pay again, but specifically tips. I find it problematic that I, as a consumer, have to make a decision about how much somebody's pay is. Do you work with companies to encourage them to move away from a tipped model to a more secure payment model, especially in sectors like hospitality? Because it really shouldn't be up to me or how busy a shift is to determine what somebody's pay looks like.
Yeah, we have not yet, but I'm fully in agreement with you. It shouldn't be the customer's burden.
It's not my job.
It's not your job.
I want to pay a fair price for a service, and I don't want to have almost this moral obligation to calculate what somebody's take-home pay should be.
And it's amazing how much tipping has spread to so many different places that has no services attached.
I just want to know what the price is when I come and pay for things. All right. I think this is a good note to wrap up on. I have one last question for you, which is what I always ask. The theme of this podcast is the invisible worker and their financial lives. And I'm persistently shocked by how little so many people know about the financial lives of the typical American worker. What is one thing you wish other people knew about this typical invisible worker?
So many things.
You can have more than one if you need to.
I wish there was more awareness about the impact of pay on workers' lives, how much a $1 or $2 an hour makes a difference for workers. I wish we knew more about the impact of inconsistent, unpredictable schedules on people's lives and how it becomes so difficult to live, to sleep, to spend time with your family or loved ones. I wish people looked at the workers in the face when they interact with them and just acknowledge them in every interaction and say thank you and not make them invisible, because we see these workers every single day. And I wish that we spent more time with each other.
I love that. Those are amazing wishes. Thank you so much, Zeynep Ton.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before you go, make sure you stay in touch. Please subscribe to the Invisible Worker podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you go to listen. That way you can follow along as we release new episodes. Thanks again, and see you soon.